Hello and welcome to Shalom Hartford. Today we're speaking to Chef Rossi. Almost one word, like share, like Prince, Mohammed, God. Chef Rossi is a well-known caterer, owner of the Raging Skillet. She's an artist, she's an author, she's a playwright. And did I mention that the Raging Skillet won #1 wedding caterer of the year for the past 15 years? Oh, and did I mention that she is the author of a new book, The Rock Queen of the Jews? Something like that. I'm Pat Kazakoff. Stay with me. Hello, Chef Rossi.
Hello, Pat. I'm thrilled to be here.
The Punk Rock Queen of the Jews, which obviously is a very, very provocative title.
Definitely is. It's definitely a mouthful. Initially, I was calling it the Queen of the Jews, but my publisher thought what didn't quite get the message across because, I'm not Queen Esther. But then when we realized it really was the Punk Rock Queen of the Jews, it meshed perfectly and kind of says it all.
So it's the Punk Rock Queen of the Jews.
That's right.
So let me start. First of all, I called you Chef Rossi in my opening, and I said it was like one word, like that's what people call you. But you must have a real name. What's your real name?
Well, so I grew up as Slava Davida Shena, or really, according to my mother, Slava Davida Shena Bas Chana Rachel, which generally was screamed up the stairs when I was in trouble. And when I was 13, it never really suited me. I always was kind of a wild kid. But when I was 13, someone in freshman year of high school named Valerie anointed me Rossi. And some people called me Rosalinda or Rosanovich. And in any case, I just became Rossi, and that's been my name ever since. And then when I got a little older, I made it my legal name. And it's kind of like a one name, like Cher or Madonna.
Well, that's what I mentioned, or Mohammed, or Mohammed.
True. And then in the catering world, I very quickly became Chef Rossi, which was useful because computers really get mad at you when you only have one name. And that's how it's been ever since. But I have started recently kind of embracing my childhood name a little bit. It makes me feel closer to my mother.
Well, first of all, there's a little something unusual about your name. First of all, Slava. That's a Hungarian name, so your parents must have had some Hungarian birthright.
Right, we're Hungarian.
You're Hungarian. And then you also, usually at the end, I noticed you had Ben Ruchel Hana or something, and usually it's Ben from the father.
Right, it should have been.
Why from the woman's name?
So it should have been Bas Moshe Vogel for my father, but it was the one brand of feminism my mother wanted to stamp on me was that I would be of her, Bas Chana Rachel, which I love because the thing that I hated the most growing up was that there just wasn't enough feminism. It was all about the boys. Like my brother had a whole different set of rules. My sister and I, we had curfews. We had a million things we weren't allowed to do. And my brother could do whatever he wanted. And it just raged against it. And when we went to the synagogue, the women weren't allowed up at the bima, and just the whole thing.
So let's talk about this punk rock period of life. That's what's provocative. Queen of the Jews, not so provocative, because you said you had Esther. So what's the deal? But this punk rock business. And then I understand from the punk rock at 16, you were put in with a Hasidic cult in Crown Heights, obviously the Lubavitchers. That's who's there. Tell me about the punk rock. I'm quite interested in what you were rebelling against, because I notice now I've read your work and you're very Jewish. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't have been rebelling against the Jewish. So number one, what were you rebelling against? And number two, how did this rebellion indicate itself?
Well, when I was growing up, I guess my parents really, they were more like having grandparents. They were older when they had kids. and they had very old world values. So I grew up mostly in the late 60s and the 70s. And that was a wild era, especially the 70s, of hard rock and punk rock. And people wanted to have fun, and I wanted to have fun. I wanted to be a normal kid. And my parents really wanted a child more appropriate, I think, for maybe the 1940s. They wanted me to button up my shirt and not go to rated R movies. They didn't want me to have Christian friends. I mean, just a million rules and regulations. And I started rebelling against it. And I also started rebelling against what I didn't even know the word feminism when I was rebelling in honor of feminism, but started rebelling against this set of rules. Like when I was younger, before puberty, I was having a great time. I was playing with boys, and I was out digging in the dirt and having cowboy and Indian fights. And the second I started looking a little bit like a girl, I wasn't allowed to do anything. My father had been a very fun-loving father, and the second I started looking a little bit like a girl, this big wall came up, and it was my sister and I on one side and my father and brother on the other side, and the whole thing didn't suit me at all.
So you didn't really rebel against, I'm not hearing you rebelling against the Jewish business.
No.
I'm hearing you rebelling against the life.
I was rebelling against my parents' kind of Jewish, not against being Jewish. Like, I've always loved being Jewish. I feel deeply in my soul that it's almost the most important thing living in there. But I rebelled profoundly against this ultra-Orthodox Judaism, against the set of double standards for boys and girls. And whenever we would go to the synagogue and the men were on one side and the women were on the other side, I hated that. I never saw a woman go up to the bima, and we'd be there on the high holidays, and I'd be ranting and raving, like, why isn't there a woman up there? Why is it only the men? And my mother would be like, shaket, you know.
Shaket bevakasha, that's what we used to say. So,
Right.
But what, you know, there were a lot of people who had your lifestyle and they didn't rebel. They liked it. It was what was. What was it in you that said, whatever it is, I don't like?
I feel in some ways like I came out of my mother's vagina like that, quite honestly. You know, I feel like I was born and I got into the world and it said, that's not right. I mean, I remember holding like Norma Ray kind of fights and rallies in grade school of things that just bothered me and just seemed wrong. And I would always take the cause of the underdog. And there also was probably this thing that I didn't understand until many years later, but I understood that I wasn't like other girls, that I didn't want to put on frilly things and dresses and makeup. Like, we went to a yeshiva for a couple of years. We'd been going to a public school in Bradley Beach, New Jersey, and I was very happy there. And I was on my way to becoming a budding juvenile delinquent. Would steal pieces of aluminum siding and ski down the alley in the winter with my friend Ronnie, and I was just having a good old time. And my parents, I think, were worried that their kids were going to turn out to be rough or trashy or something. And so they decided to drop us off in this yeshiva where the kids there had been going to school together since they were 4 years old, and they all spoke Hebrew. Most of them were Syrian. They were eating pita bread and olives for lunch. And we were just like, what the hell is a pita bread? And we didn't speak Hebrew. We only ever were taught how to read it. And they made me wear a maxi skirt every day of school. And I hated dresses. I'd always hated dresses.
You were really conscious. You were really conscious as a young person that something's not right. Like you, and you said that you think you got it when you came out.
Right.
Like you said, you don't think it was learned. You
Right.
think that you were just born thinking this is not right. That's very interesting to me, because I think a lot of that behavior is learned, and then you see people stop it as they get older. They just don't, they don't feel like that anymore. But you seem to keep going with this headspace. So how did this rebellion indicate itself? Like, what did you do to show this rebellion besides wearing like a torn t-shirt and torn jeans? Was there any more to the rebellion?
Sure, a lot. Well, when I graduated grammar school, I was so unhappy. I guess I probably was depression. And I would run home from school to my bedroom and run into my bed and put all my pillows on my head and just try to force myself into a daydream or a dream where I could be who I wanted to be and be happy. But then the summer after grade school, before high school, I went away for the summer and just exploded out of my cocoon because it had been 2 years of being miserable and sort of stuffing my feelings. And I marched into high school looking like a cross between Joan Jett and Janis Joplin, and just hooting and hollering and just never looked back. And my mother wanted to know what happened to her.
Really, really crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy.
Yep.
Would you say that would be an appropriate description?
I think good crazy, but yeah.
Okay, good crazy. Okay, so we're marching in.
Right. So my mother wanted to know what happened to her straight A, quiet girl, Slava, that disappeared in the 8th grade, and who is this weird demon Rossi, And I said, Slava died in the 8th grade, and that girl's never coming back. This is who I am. This is who I've always been, but I was stuffed so much that it was either become who I really was or probably not want to live. And so I decided I wanted to live. And I joined theater, which I always feel saved my life because it was sort of everything was repressive and conforming and confining. And suddenly I joined theater and I'm meeting people that are, gay and bisexual and punk rock and new wave and every kind of creative type. And everything was okay. You could just love who you wanted to love and be who you wanted to be. And even at that point, I still didn't know that I was gay, but I knew that I loved these people and I loved freedom. And immediately I started painting and writing, and all of my creative life exploded out of me. And so eventually, of course, my parents were horrified. They didn't like any of my friends. I was constantly telling them I was going to the Jewish Community Center, and then I would have my friends pick me up behind the Jewish Community Center. We'd go out bar hopping, or we'd go to drag queen bars or punk rock clubs. And, eventually it was just getting worse and worse. So I realized that what I had to do was I had to run away from home because I just didn't think that I was going to survive. I mean, I've never been someone who was a big drinker or drug user, but I was so unhappy and so miserable that I was drinking and taking drugs and doing things that you do when you're just trying to medicate. And I recognized that that was dangerous and that I had to get out. So I enrolled in a rapid promotion program where you could graduate high school in 3 years if you doubled up on your classes and took a summer class or two. It was a sort of modeled after a college program. When you got your 128 credits, you could graduate kind of thing. So I graduated in 3 years at 16. And then once I had my diploma, so I'm not so much of a rebel that I don't have a farsight too. So I knew I didn't want to drop out. I knew I wanted my diploma. I knew that I had my plans. So I started saving money and I was just planning for the whole thing. And so I ran away.
And underneath all this rebellion is a nice Jewish girl.
Right.
You can't get away from that.
Right, exactly.
And that's why you're still planning, because it's not smart not to have a high school degree.
Right, exactly.
And to have no money is not smart either.
Right. So it was well thought out. I think I had like $3,000 in the bank at the point that I ran away, and I got my diploma, and then I proceeded to have a fabulous time. I had like a 2 or 3 month long party. I moved into a motel in Long Branch, New Jersey, which was the only thing I found affordable. I think it was like $70 a week. And this particular motel was famous for its high murder rate. There were several prostitutes living there. There were drug dealers running a business in the parking lot. But I learned very quickly that no matter how terrible the place is that you're living in, if you're nice to everybody, then they're going to look after you. So even though someone else might get mugged in that hotel, no one was going to bother me because I had everybody looking after me. And so
we're 16 at that point.
Right.
Yeah. Well, there's the smart Jewish girl coming out again. Do what you need to do to survive this mess. by any other name. It's a mess.
It's a terrible mess. I found out later on that evidently a famous murder had happened there. Some mafioso was murdered there in the 70s. I didn't even know about that. I think it was called the Fountain Motel. So I decided, I had a lot of my friends, they basically all looked like they were 16 years old. But when I was 16, I really looked like I was like a 35-year-old woman. I kind of had a tired, worn out look of just having been through too much. And so I was having a party in my hotel room. And at that point, I had started playing around with food. I had a little hot plate. And when I ran away from home, I made sure to take all my mother's Star-Kissed tuna in water. See, Jews will only ever say tuna in water. They won't say tuna. And her ragu tomato sauce and her ronzoni pasta. I had this ton of food. And so I made my what would become my famous dish, at least as a teenager, which was my tuna pasta. It's kind of like a white trash puttanesca, I suppose. And I had my friends over.
I've tasted it.
What's that?
I think I've tasted it.
Oh, it's very yummy. It really is.
Did you add Campbell's mushroom soup to it?
No, but I've been told that's a good thing to add.
Yes, it's tuna and mushroom soup and noodles, and you bake it to death. And there's something that's very pleasant about it.
Oh, it's nice. This one, I think this one was ragu tomato sauce, the tuna, and also olives I'd pilfered from the bar, that martini olives that I cut up, and then the ronzoni pasta. My friends thought it was the best. Of course, they were stoned out of their mind, but anything would taste good. And so I had this great party, and the manager of the motel started getting scared that there were too many teenagers. He figured no one would bother him with the prostitutes and drug dealers, but if there's a lot of teenagers there, maybe he's going to get in trouble. And so he called the cops. And the cops showed up and took me to the police station. And they actually thought that I was an older woman corrupting minors, having like teenagers there and giving them beer and things like that. And I didn't want to show them my ID because I knew that they would call my parents if I did. So we went to the police station, and the cop threatened to put me in a cell with a prostitute named Luscious Lucy, who used to stab her clients with a nail file and take their wallet. So
very pleasant.
Very pleasant. So of course, big tough Rossi, I handed over my ID in about 5 seconds. I'm like, here you go. You know, I was scared. Then they realized I was 16 and obviously wasn't corrupting minors, and they called my parents. So
that's when your life changed.
That's when everything changed.
Yeah.
My parents showed up and they put me in the Volare, the red Volare, and started driving. And I thought we were just going home. But then we drove past our town, and we drove past all the towns I knew. And it seemed like all the colors disappeared. All the trees and the flowers of New Jersey disappeared, and the sand and all the things that were part of the fabric of my childhood disappeared. And everything started looking dark and brown. And we drove past really terrible looking neighborhoods and graffiti. And then we got into a neighborhood that the graffiti stopped, but the colors were not there. I just remember feeling like it was like watching The Wizard of Oz when it goes from black and white to color, only this was like in reverse.
And you ended up in Crown Heights at not Lubavitcher headquarters, but with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which you describe in your book. He and his wife, you call him Redbeard.
Right. So this is not the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I met him.
No,
but this is a Lubavitcher rabbi.
Right. He's
a long red beard.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you about that. I know many of my listeners and our watchers know a lot about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and what he represents and what the Lubavitcher lifestyle is. Here in Hartford, we have a very strong presence with Chabad. It's a very, very strong presence. And I understand that you lived in that lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And from everything you say, it seems like that lifestyle was hard on you also. It was also hard. But I also detect in your book that there's something that you liked about it, There's something that was special to you. And this is a question I ask all my guests. Would you say that on some level, your success, because you are successful in what you do, was influenced by Judaism or by the Lubavitcher Rebbe?
Well, there's a lot of what happened. Well, I feel like Judaism influences almost everything I do. So that's kind of at the core. But there's a lot of what happened in the Crown Heights year that I realize is in every part of my life, especially when I decided to write the book. It took me a really long time to write the book, because if I had written it 20 years ago, I think I would have been too angry. And if I had written it even 10 years ago, I think I might have still been too angry. And I had my mother's voice in my head the whole time whenever I would write anything about what happened there. And she would say, don't do it if it's bad for the Jews. Don't say it if it's bad for the Jews. Don't write it if it's bad for the Jews. And so I think if I had published the book 10 or 20 years ago, it's possible someone would have read it and then wanted to hate Hasidic people, because I did meet some really, really terrible people when I was in that neighborhood. But I just took the time and probably a certain amount of therapy, and I took some distance from it, and I thought about all of the wonderful people that I met and the love that I met too. And I made sure to wrap myself up in so much of that I could simply tell the story. And I don't think anyone would read it and then go out and hate Jews or hate Hasidic people. I think they would read it and say, well, she met some wonderful people, but
I read it and I got that, as you see, I got that feeling that with all this rebellion and all this crazy amount of stuff and cooking ronzoni with chips and marshmallows, and it's crazy. But I got the sense as I was reading that part of your success, you didn't say it in the book, but I got the feeling that you attribute to the Rebbe, that there's something in you that says, that is why I'm successful, because I'm Jewish and because the Rebbe somehow influenced you when he gave you a little wine to drink as opposed to honey cake. Am I wrong in that assumption?
That was probably, I don't know if I can say it was the most powerful moment of my life, but it's certainly up there in like the top 10, if not the top 5. When here I was at a time in my life when in a lot of ways I felt like a throwaway, kind of a street kid heading in the wrong direction, just angry and rebellious. I was mainly fueled by anger, and which was a good thing actually, because my parents had somehow neglected to read a newspaper except for Jewish newspapers in 1981, or they would have known that they just shipped their little girl off to one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in New York in 1981. Crown Heights, Brooklyn in 1981, forget about it. I think the murder rate was like 1,700 people the year that I got shipped off or something. And there were terrifying things that were happening all the time. And I had so much anger that it acted almost like gasoline, and it fueled me. And I was in this sort of survival mode where I just would get through these impossible situations and survive. But it's a terrible thing to be fueled just by that kind of thing. It hurts your stomach and it hurts your soul. And so my friends all wanted to drag me to see the Rebbe, because we were always up in the Women's Tower in 770, the famous synagogue. And I hated being up in the Women's Tower, and I would complain all the time. Why can't the women be down there in the air singing and dancing? Why are we shoved up here in the claustrophobic tower where you might faint from the heat? And the other women would be like, shh, don't, no, that's not sneer, don't do that. And that I wanted to start like a peace rally in 770. But so one day, the Rebbe decided to have a Verbrennen in the main part that's always for the men. And finally, it was a chance for the women to come down to the open, airy main part where the Rebbe was. And at that point, there just were an enormous amount of people in Crown Heights. I don't know if those kind of crowds come since the Rebbe passed away, but it was like 700 or more women were lined up to get their blessing from the Rebbe. And so I was kind of talked into it, but I had a lot of curiosity to finally be downstairs after always complaining about it so much. And I'd seen the Rebbe from a distance, and to see him up close. So I went along with it, but I was getting hungrier and hungrier and hungrier because I didn't plan on being online for like 3 hours or something. And then I get all the way up to the Rebbe, and I realized just a moment before I'm going to meet the Rebbe that I hadn't asked my friends, like, what do you call him? What do you say to him? And actually, I still don't know what you should call him or say to him. I guess it's probably more respectful a tone than I had because I didn't know what I was doing. But I got up to him, and I think the first thing I did probably was I got up closer to him than maybe was polite. I knew enough not to try and touch him, but and then I just went, "Hiya, Rebbe," and he's like, "Who's this freak?" I still had pink streaks in my hair. I think he just like started giggling, and he said something to these men behind him, which I don't recall. I think it was probably Yiddish, but I don't know what he said. And then he pushes this little shot of wine for me, and I didn't know what to do. I just stood there like an idiot. And finally the women, and he says, saying something to the people behind him, and he's laughing. And the women behind me are screaming, "Drink it, drink it." So I shoot it down like a shot, and I start almost like choking. And then I'm just staring at him, and I felt like I stared at him for an hour, and he stared at me for an hour. I'm sure this whole interlude was like a couple of minutes. And so then I didn't know what else to say. I said, "Well, thank you, Rebbe." And
So let's be realistic. The Rebbe has seen a lot of people like you, because that's the Chabad business. The Chabad business is
outreach, big on outreach.
On outreach. That's the whole movement. So I'm going to ask the question again that I asked before. So do you feel that the Rebbe had some influence on your success? Like, is there something in you that attributes your success to that experience?
Well, I felt that he looked very, very deeply into my eyes, and I felt somehow that he knew everything about me, because he really had this mystical thing. I mean, I don't even think you would have to believe in God. And even if you were an atheist and you met the Rebbe, you would have to know that this guy really had a mystical thing going on. I've never met anyone who was in the Bible, because that happened thousands of years ago. But I'm pretty sure that if you met someone who, like a prophet from the Bible, that maybe the Rebbe would have been similar to them. If the Bible was written now, he definitely would have wound up in the Bible. He just was powerful and profound.
Well, the fact that you even talk, that you use, that we're just talking here about prophets. I mean, who talks about prophets? Nobody talks about prophets except people in that business. And clearly, you're not in that business. You're the Raging Skillet.
Right.
That's your business. And the fact that you're talking about it implies a certain amount of spirituality, a certain amount of belief. You say in your book that when you met the Rebbe, what he talked about, what you heard, was peace, unity, and love, and mitzvahs. Well, how can anybody be against that? It's physically impossible. And here you are.
I used to feel when he would speak generally in Yiddish, and I would pick out a word or two because my mother spoke Yiddish when I was growing up. But sometimes when he would speak, I would be hearing things in my own head that I have felt that he was telling me that, like, am I getting like a psychic connection with him? Like, there was this one moment where he was in the middle of talking, and all of a sudden I understood what he was saying. I suppose it's like if you were trying to learn English and you finally understood what someone was saying. And I knew he said neshama, the soul, and he's something else. Suddenly I was like, I get it. He's talking about the soul. He's talking about how, you shouldn't be caught up in caring about gold. You should be caught up in caring about your soul and your children. And I suddenly got it. And so I said, I hear you,
Well, what he was talking about, the translation of that in your language would be, he's really talking about authenticity.
Right, exactly.
That's what he's really talking about. Now, we could talk and talk and talk, and we haven't covered. You have a new book out, and you had a beautiful play that ran in Hartford for 5 weeks. That's a lot to sell out audiences.
Right.
So you have a lot going, and we could talk a lot, but we're nearing the end of our time together. Is there one thing that you want to tell the audience that we haven't lighted on?
Well, I think authenticity is probably the most important word that you just said. And something, when you asked, did it affect my life, the experience with the Rebbe, my friends at the time afterwards, I didn't understand what a big deal it was, what happened with the Rebbe. And they're like, you don't understand, like the Rebbe blessed you. And that's forever. And I was like, yeah, but, later on, I'm like, but I don't think I'm heterosexual, and I don't want to be like people here are. That's not me. And my friend Anya said, the Rebbe looked at you and he knew who you were. He knew who you love. He knew everything about you, and he blessed you anyway. And he's telling you you're A-okay with him. And I'm like, well, you know what? If I'm A-okay with him, maybe everything I'm doing is just A-okay.
And maybe you are A-okay. Maybe
right.
You are A-okay. I've been speaking to Chef Rossi here at Shalom Hartford, and it's a very, very big story, but you're listening to a person whose catering company, the Raging Skillet, is the #1 wedding catering company of, I'm not going to say the world, but certainly among the Knot, which is a national magazine. So thank you, Chef Rossi. Thank you for being here. I'm wishing you all the success that you deserve. And what I'm still hearing is you might be the punk rock queen of the Jews, but I'm just speaking to a nice Jewish girl. And you know what? That's good enough for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.